Welcome, everyone. I think we're just about ready to get started. Welcome to our Spring 2021 Friday Forum series, the Digital Misshaping and Shaping of the World. If you've been joining us, you hopefully have been able to hear some really great talks in this series so far. If this is your first time joining, welcome. I hope you really enjoy this series. We have a really great conversation to have today. So we're really excited to have everyone here. To set the scene a little bit for anyone who may be attending Friday Forum for the first time, or even if you've already been attending but want a little bit of a refresher, Friday Forum is a weekly lecture series that's held every semester here at the University Y, and it strives to raise awareness about national and international trends happening all around the world, and really just provide us a space to address topics that are of relevance and of urgency in our society today. Some of our past events, if you've been able to join us, have been looking at topics like using art as activism. We've talked about environmental justice. Last semester, we looked at the current state of our democracy and what that meant, and many, many other really great topics. So we're really excited to continue providing this space for everyone here. Quickly in the chat, I'm going to send in a list of all of our sponsors for this series. This event wouldn't be able to happen without the support of all of these amazing people who have provided their sponsorship and support for this series. So thank you to everyone who has done that so far. If you're interested in figuring out and learning how you can be a sponsor for the future series, definitely please feel free to reach out to the University Y, and we'd be happy to make that happen. So to give a little context of the series for this semester, like I said, the title is The Digital Misshaping and Shaping of the World. And really what we're looking at is currently we're all in the midst of an unprecedented pandemic. And many of us are using technology much more than we ever have before, and in many new ways than we probably have, that we have been used to. The world of technology really opens many doors for global connections, but there's also consequences that come with technology and the way it is used and utilized by different people. So with growing digital interactions, there's a greater need for us to really understand the intersections between technology and things like race, class, privacy, education, faith, public health, and many of these other social factors. And how these intersections impact our everyday experiences is really just something for us to consider and are critical for us to really be actively looking into as we move forward and as we continue using technology more and more. Last week, if you were able to join us, we had Dr. Noble, who talked about her research and her book, Algorithms of Oppression, How Search Engines Reinforce Racism. Before that, we've had speakers who joined us and talked about the intersection of Black culture and technology, about using data and technology for social good, disrupting disinformation, and also even the connection between faith and technology during the light of the pandemic. So really amazing conversations, all from really looking at different factors of our social life and how technology are really just being implemented and ingrained into all of those. And so today I'm really excited to have Daniel Gonzalez with us. Daniel is a PhD candidate in the Department of Geography and Geographic Sciences at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And his research focuses on the science and technologies of racial capitalism, particularly as they pertain to the regimes of US border enforcement and immigration management. And today, as you can see by the slides, he's going to talk to us a little bit about how data is used in immigrant surveillance and immigrant management. As you're listening to the talk, if you have any questions that come up, if there are any things that he's talking about that, really incite some questions that you're having, please feel free to use the chat feature or the Q&A feature to send questions, and we will hopefully have a little bit of time for some Q&A towards the end of the talk. But without further ado, Daniel, go ahead and pass it on to you.
Okay. Thank you for the introduction. I just want to thank the series and the YMCA for having such a wonderful talk, or a series of talks. I was lucky to see a few of them so far, and they all been amazing. So, and I want to thank the audience out there who's probably missing lunch or having lunch while you're listening to this. Yeah. So today I'm going to present a little bit about the research I've been doing for the past 4 or 5 years. And it's really on immigrant surveillance and data management. Right, so how I came to my research. So maybe a few years ago, I heard, or in 2016 actually, I saw an article that was talking about then Governor of New Jersey, Chris Christie, given a talk about immigration. And this article quoted Chris Christie, and there was a really interesting quote in there, and he mentions this. He says, "At any moment, FedEx can tell you where that package is. It's on a truck, it's at the station, it's on the airplane, yet we let people come into this country, and the minute they come in, we lose track of them. We need to have a system that tracks you from the moment you come in," right? Fast forward a couple years later, I'm sure a lot of people remember the government shutdown that happened in late 2018, early 2019, when the Senate sort of stops the funding for Trump's border wall and the government shuts down, right? Is one of the longest shutdowns in US history. 19 days into that shutdown, there was a response by Democrat Senate leaders, Nancy Pelosi and Schumer. In that rebuttal of Trump's argument, or their response, the Democrat senators' response to it, they also say something that was really interesting. And basically, they denounce Trump's building of a border wall, yet they denounce the wall, but still push for the money being spent on a border. And they say, we don't need a wall. A wall is old, outdated technology. We already have a smart border, and the money should be spent on them. So they weren't denouncing the use of the money for the wall. They were just more concerned about where the money was actually going, right? So these two sort of instances sort of embody or represent sort of approaches to immigration management more recently. It also, at the same time, like I come to my research from this paradox that it is seen throughout the history of US immigration enforcement. And I think a professor in Asian American studies here at the University of Illinois, Dr. Paik, in her new book, she points this out, and I think it's also very important. So the border embodies a paradoxical relationship between the state's efforts to exclude unwanted migrants and the economy's reliance on the labor of undocumented people. So throughout the history of US border, we could see this sort of paradox between the exclusion and the racialized practices, the violences that want to keep migrants out of the country, but at the same time, the needs for capitalism to keep the labor of migrants, right? This is even embodied in Trump, who on one hand will say, build a wall, we need to keep these people out. And on the other hand, research has been done to show his workforce at his hotels are mostly migrant women of color, right? And I think that also symbols this paradox. And my research is trying to grapple with these, with both the comments that these political leaders make and also this paradox, right? And a lot of researchers have, in recent dates, have argued that the border is more than just a wall, right? In popular and public conception, we often associate the wall with the border, right? But activists, researchers, and academics have shown technologies in places like border zones, which is 100 miles away from the place where two countries meet, right? Or the jurisdiction of a country, is also part of the border. So this includes checkpoints that are away from the border, technologies like car license plate readers, driver's license and passports are extensions of the border. Biometric and facial recognition technologies are also part of the border, right? We also see electronic monitoring devices like ankle shackles and check-in technologies, which are becoming more and more common, right? This video and voice recording devices, for example, security and traffic light cameras they've been argued to be part of the border. Drones, satellite and balloon monitoring. All these technologies, more and more, are becoming part of a larger border infrastructure that I'll be talking about today. Right? And this has led to new definitions of what the border is. And the one that I find most helpful for me and for my work is this definition, right? The definition of the border increasingly refers not to the territorial limit of the state, but to the management practices directed at where the migrant is, right? And this is the definition that I build my research upon. And I want to keep this in our heads, the management practices directed at where the migrant is, right? My research then asked a particular question about these. If the border is made up of the management practices directed at where the migrant is, I ask, how are all these individual technologies and management practices linked and coordinated, right? And particularly how the Department of Homeland Security uses these technologies as a larger infrastructure, right? So there's been already some work on some of these technological infrastructures, right? One is within that border zone, so the 100 miles from the border, right? Where we could see these closed systems where they integrate aircraft, checkpoints, border stations, ICE agents, vehicles, surveillance cameras, etc., right? And this is a closed system where all these technologies are linked. One of these was the Integrated Computer-Aided Detection System, also called ICAD, which was developed in 1998. A second place where this occurs, where this technological infrastructure occurs, is at the airport. So TSA agents have access to individuals' phone technologies when you log on to the airport's Wi-Fi unit, or you use one of their services, and they're able to track people as they move through the process of checking in and getting on their plane, checking out, and going to their destination, right? These are two examples of this infrastructure of the border and how it's sort of linked and coordinated, right? And the technical way it's linked and coordinated is through something called data interoperability, right? And data interoperability basically is the ability for one software platform to receive and understand data generated from a different software platform, right? This has become commonplace. One example of it, and it's a simple example of it, but it might make sense to a lot of us, is, has anybody recently purchased something from PayPal, from an online vendor? And sometimes the online vendor will offer you to log in through your PayPal account or your Facebook account. And you log in, and all of a sudden your information is there, including your credit card. Everything you need to do is logged in, and all you have to do is verify your purchase, and you're completed the purchase. That is made possible through data interoperability. The ability for PayPal, who is sort of like a new age banker, and the vendor or the online store, they each have their own databases, but there's been technology where these two databases could communicate with each other through data interoperability. So data interoperability becomes crucial to my project. I understand how this works and how it links particular databases, right? Interoperability in migrant governance is not new. It's been around since 2004 to 2005, and probably longer than that. This is just the more direct evidence I have for it, but it's probably been around a lot longer, right? So in 2004, the DHS tasked the Department of Justice to create a national information exchange model called NIAM. NIAM is a computer language that facilitates communications around different levels or institutions of government while still allowing each institution to keep their own distinct platforms, right? So this is sort of at a time when the government wants to use these technologies and is trying to figure out how is the best way to move forward. So basically what it's trying to do is trying to link institutions and departments that are housed under DHS. Agriculture, this includes agriculture, biometrics, chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear concerns, emergency management, human services, immigration, and etc. Right? So DHS is looking at a way in which all these institutions could communicate with each other, and they have a shared language. Right? So a year after that initial report, a summary comes out. And this summary sort of directs the agency to implement a timeline. I'm going to zoom in into one of these these moments in the timeline. This one, and I'm not sure if you could read it or not, but I'll start off with it together. Together, the departments make a recommendation for the most technically feasible and cost-effective alternative, along with a cost and schedule estimate to achieve the interoperability need to support sharing of alien immigration history, criminal history, and terrorist information based on positive identification and the interoperabilities of the two agencies that were produced because of interoperability, IDENT and IAFIS. So as we could see here, interoperability has been a big concern for at least 15 years, if not more. So the state practices these practices of information management and data interoperability as a way to expand its capacities, right? At the at the same time, we see government investment or spending in the IT sector expand. So in 2019, state, federal, and local governments spent a total of approximately $107.6 billion on IT. And this does not include the Department of Defense's budget or classified expenditures, stuff that they don't really want us to know about. But all other forms of government spent over $100 billion on IT. DoD in this year's fiscal budget includes $841 million for artificial intelligence and $789 million on cloud technologies. Both of these technologies rely on database interoperability, right? There's also trends, which I'm not going to talk about here in this presentation, but my research looks into these other trends. But there's been trends in government investment in blockchain technologies, which is basically a ledger technology, and Internet of Things, which is basically network connected devices. So think of like a Fitbit or the Wi-Fi like robot that vacuums your house. These are Internet of Things. So these are things that operate on their own, but have a database that's outside of them. Right? Like I said, I'm not going to talk too much about these types of technologies today, but I do look at them. Right? So interoperability has also grown in the private sector. And this has sort of become to be known as surveillance capitalism. Right? So here's a forecast that was made, I think it was made in, or here's a forecast that shows the growth of money spent on interoperability since 2011. So in 2011, interoperability generates $7.6 billion. 10 years later, in 2001, it sees a growth in 800% to $64 billion. And it's only projected to grow even more and more. Right? So data interoperability has become prominent in all forms of industry, everything from healthcare to logistical supply chain and production processes, insurance, education, banking, retail. It's everywhere. Like I said, when you want to buy something online, most often they ask you, do you want to use another database to log into this database so you don't have to fill out your information, right? So interoperability has become prominent within our society. Right? So much so that there's been a bunch of studies and research on this, and they've sort of have labeled this phenomenon as information capitalism. And, so there's a lot of definitions on what this is. People debate over this, but I think an easy way to understand it, I try to boil down like a bunch of definitions to one, information capitalism is basically the packaging and selling of individuals' life cycles, choices, habits, behaviors, and networks. So in many ways, it's the commodification of people's everyday life actions that are being sold to either marketers or different agencies. And it's become so prominent that even institutions like the University of Illinois, with its Rockwire program, sees value in providing such services, right? So Rockwire is a mobile ecosystem that basically students download an app. That app provides students with different resources on campus, but at the same time, developers have access to that app and they pay the university to various degrees access to the information produced by the students, right? So it's common, it's here, right? However, what I've told you so far is not the whole story. And there's an important history that I want to briefly go over. I'm not going to go too much in detail in either one of these, but I think it's really important that we keep this in mind, right? The first one is probably more known and probably everybody on here knows about. US border policy and law has always been a racist project. Like this is everything from the Chinese Exclusion Act to farm worker programs to border laws that were passed during 9/11. The US border policy has always been a racist project. And this is something we have to build our analysis of what the border is based on this, in my opinion. A lesser known history is the classics and racist history of the computer. The first, or a lot of historians, science and technology historians, have said that this man on the left, Charles Babbage, and his difference engine was the first proto-computer. It was basically a mechanical computer, or a mechanical calculation device that calculated insurance premiums. Babbage was an actuary, so he made insurance policies. He was also known for being, for hating the poor, people who were sick, and the elderly and children. So he starts developing his difference engine in order to calculate certain populations out of the general population in Britain. So he wanted to have a way to do these complex calculations, right? Base insurance off those calculations by removing like the sick populations, removing Irish immigrants, removing poor from the premiums. So in many ways, the way we understand insurance premiums now is based off of Babbage. And he develops this machine to do that. He also so he sets out to build this machine. This machine proves to be too difficult for him to produce alone. So the British government reaches out to him and says, we'll fund you to continue finishing your machine if you use the machine, or you help us use the machine to develop new ways of understanding population and demographics, right? So in many ways, this early history of the computer is a history of creating difference, of separating one part of the population from the other for the needs of economics, particularly in his case, insurance. And the government wanted to do this in order to figure out where taxes or revenue from taxes would go. All right, so I want us to keep both these histories in the background as we move forward. So US border has always been racist, and this history of the creation of the computer, right? So as I move forward, I want to sort of backpedal and look at the border as a project of racialized population management for capitalism. So in this sense, the border is similar to what people have argued the prison industrial complex is, right? It's both designed to manage and control racialized population. The prison warehouses and manages Black and brown populations, while the border ensures there's always a present and always deportable racialized devalued labor force. And I recommend, if anybody hasn't read this book, Golden Gulag, please read it. It's really important. It's really good. Right? So this sort of brings me to what does, I briefly told you a quick history, both recent and old, but this leads us to what is interoperability now. So interoperability has become a staple for how governments proceed in governing, right? They have created a bunch of contracts or calls for contracts with a number of high-tech companies. The most visible, but not the only one, is Palantir. And if we could see the picture in the screen, here's a picture of one of ICE's agents' screen as they research and investigate their cases, right? So we could see the access, what they have. They have access to nighttime surveillance cameras. They have access to the ability to identify particular geospatial features like cars, people walking. They even have topography. They have all kinds of information on these apps, and this is made possible through interoperability, right? So in many ways, what Palantir's investigative case management system does for ICE is that it links the DEA, ATF, FBI, and a bunch of other state and private law enforcement agencies together in one system, right? And it coordinates information on an individual's schooling, family records, employment information, phone records, immigration history, foreign exchange program status, personal connections, biometric traits, criminal records, and home and work addresses. So this system allows ICE agents access to this information on anybody. Right? And so what does this look like compared to like other forms of technologies? So on the left here, I have just someone's GPS location from their phone, right? It just has a blue dot and it just tells me the person's within in this general area. However, what interoperability and what Palantir's case management system does, it's able to turn one of these dots into these clusters and then connects these clusters to other clusters. So no longer do you have a blue dot, you have a whole bunch of networks that IMC. And of course it's racialized. Of course, there's a lot of aspects to this, right? So you can see the name of the person that they're supposedly surveilling, right? All right. So next, I'm going to move on to two specific examples from my own research. So I wanted to figure out what is this form of documentation and information transfer look like as it plays out. So my first example is from San Francisco's Sanctuary City, right? So Sanctuary City offers, in many places, it's different in different places, but in San Francisco in particular, it sort of says that, okay, we have local law enforcement here, and we're gonna, and they're not gonna be allowed to work with federal law enforcement agencies like DHS or ICE, right? And sanctuary cities often offer non-citizens services that people need, right? Such as IDs or driver's license or access to health, access to job, training, housing, right? A lot of these practices or a lot of these services require forms of require practices of documentation, such as IDs. So here we could see an ID card, right? I call this form of sanctuary administrative sanctuary. In many ways, it documents the undocumented. And then once I sort of figured this out, I sort of asked this question, where does this information go? Who has access to it? And what I found is that all cities, including sanctuary cities, often apply to federal grants. For example, the FEMA, which is housed under DHS. Cities will apply for FEMA grants for disaster preparedness or for secure cities initiatives. So there's all kinds of programs where cities need funding. They reach out to the federal government. And a lot of times the federal government is housed under DHS. But some of the stipulations of these contracts or these grants say that in order for the city to get funding, they have to provide DHS access to their databases. So in Sanctuary City, FEMA's disaster preparedness grant, even though the city doesn't directly work with local law enforcement or doesn't work with federal law enforcement still has access to their databases through these programs. Okay, so what are the consequences of this? So my research shows that through database integration, state institutional jurisdictions are becoming more and more obscure and complex. There's less state accountability and liability. Practices of administrative sanctuary it looks like they're acting as digital checkpoints. And I argue that these are part or extensions of the border. Smart borders keep records of migrants' activities and possibly can foreclose future claims to citizenship. For example, in 2018, DHS, this was challenged and overturned, but it just points to like how this stuff can and will be used. So immigrants that were participating in health and nutrition programs, because their information was held in particular databases and DHS had access to their database, they end up becoming targets of Trump's administration and deportation efforts. Right? So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a bit, but I'm going to move on to my second example. So my second example is looking at these large-scale ICE raids. In particular, in O'Neill, Nebraska, in 2018, there was a large-scale raid. 133 people were arrested, and the arrest occurred in 2 locations: O'Neill Ventures, which we could see in this top photo here, and Alcorn River Farms, which was a potato farm. What was interesting about the raids was the timing of the raids. The raids happened at the end of growing season and harvest, and after 70 hours of a 70-hour work week, and right before the workers were going to get paid. And although I don't have like concrete evidence, I suggest that this is like actually planned. And records, however, even though they didn't state that implicitly, they did point to the way ICE used information in their raids. So ICE used federal, state, and local databases for surveillance. They used phone data. They used shopping habits. They used something called network analysis, which is basically finding contacts within your social media. They used family information to track, monitor, and deport. And at the same time as this happens, as we could see in the picture of O'Neill Ventures, farms are increasingly relying on smart technologies, right? This doesn't even look like what we would imagine a farm to be. It looks like a warehouse, right? It's closed. There are security cameras everywhere. There's all kinds of sensors, monitoring sensors. So as farms are increasingly relying on smart technology, right? We could see here this diagram which advocates for more smart technologies on a farm, which rely on private clouds and interoperability. In that same year, DHS requires that these smart farms be integrated with their databases. Because remember, DHS also houses the Department of Agriculture. So in many ways, the Department of Agriculture helps farmers address certain issues that farmers face. So under that pretense, DHS has asked smart farms to be integrated with their databases. Right? So what is the consequences of this particular example? Interoperability means the border operates very far away from the border zone. So on the top photo of the map, that is what we traditionally, or what jurisdictionally is the border zone. It's 100 miles away from the continental US. It's also in Canada and Hawaii, but that's not on this map, right? But DHS's own website has its own version of the map, which is this interconnected network. And we see the border zone operating within or outside of the 100 miles, right? So what I am pointing to in this section or this research is that IT, or IMC in this case, plays a pivotal role in the management of farm labor. And it ensures the circulation of racialized and devalued labor, right? Considering that the timing of the raid and why it happened, right? So this makes us question the border isn't just about the violent practices of defining territory, but also in the everyday practices of migrant management, from the documentation, from migrants using the phone. Okay, all right, so this is, of course, like only a couple of examples. Increasingly, we're seeing more and more ICE and federal governments using this information in different aspects of governance. So we see schools intensifying surveillance around COVID. We see DHS relying more and looking for mobile fingerprinting technologies. We see DHS plans to start collecting eye data and scans and DNA with defense contractors. We see the FBI starting to surveil people who are border protesters and classifying them as extremist organizations. We see ICE using private utility databases to sort of do research on migrant violations. We also see the buying of data from these agencies from different companies. So for example, DHS bought a bunch of information from Facebook recently, right? So the larger implication is legal jurisdictions are becoming increasingly blurry. And this puts people who need access to these resources in very difficult situations. Because on one hand, migrants need a driver's license so they could go to work and back. They need access to healthcare. They need these services. But on the other hand, these services are extending this network of surveillance and this information infrastructure, right? And I think this is related to recent talks about public charge, where we see the federal government pushing for changes in public charge to make people more deportable based on their use of public services. Although this was recently shut down, I could still see this as an effort in order to make this possible, right? So when we often talk about the border, we often talk about the border and its violences in terms of exclusion, how it excludes people from society. But I think we need to make that a little bit more nuanced. And we need to question the way these tech practices and these violence are of differential inclusion, right? So for example, the sanctuary city, people are included, but they're included in only a limited or a partial way, right? So you have access to a driver's license, but you're not a full citizen. So you're not protected by those rights of citizenship, but you're able to drive. And I think these technologies are making this more and more possible, right? And also, I think we need to move away from understanding these technologies as individual surveillances. So surveilling individual people. And I think it's better if we understand them as a form of surveillance and group management, right? And also another implication is that everyone, citizen and non-citizen, is subjugated to in various degrees, right? Some people are treated like consumers and targeted more by marketers. Some people, like activists, are more surveilled, while others are deported. So everyone, to some degree, is subjugated to this infrastructure, but at various levels. All right, so what do we do? So we need to make data and information databases political, right? Don't, so here's a report by Deloitte, one of the largest accounting and tax service fees for large corporations. Last year writes a report to the medical industry. And in this report, they say, and I think this is very telling of what interoperability is. So they basically are advocating for interoperability in the health industry. And they're saying, they're giving, in this report, they give a bunch of reasons why like hospitals should adopt interoperability. They say, and here they quote some unknown government official, and they say interoperability is 20% technical and 80% economic and political. And I feel like a lot of the people in charge, both in the government and in and corporate elite, understand the politics behind this. But people who resist borders are only partially starting to become aware. And I think we need to make this more political. Right? And then what can we do as we make data and information bases more political, right? I think this can happen on different scales, and I think we need to look at it in different scales. So for service providers, I think we need to talk about what is happening to the data and where is it going. We need to, and also I think service providers need to be upfront with their clients about data and the potential uses of data, right? We need more transparency and ways to make services anonymous. So for example, if you're a nonprofit and you do stuff on health or migrant health, we need to find ways to make those services anonymous so people could have access to the services, but not be implicated or enrolled into this larger information infrastructure. Also, I think there's a lot of coalition building that could be built around challenging this, right? So we need to advocate for better privacy laws. Analyze how state institutions are using interoperability to transgress state jurisdictions. We need to contest these jurisdictional transgressions. And also people who are differentially included or marked differentially included, people like formerly incarcerated people who often have to check a box to show that they're not full citizens or not treated like full citizens. People like activists also share similar relations to non-citizen migrants. And here is a potential for these groups to come together to challenge some of these things. Right. And for general population, for us, I think we need to be more cautious about the information or giving consent to particular apps, information. So right now, often this stuff is all legal because we give consent to it. So when you download a Facebook app or you use Facebook, you're giving away your right to your information. And the government has now found a way to utilize that information. So I think we need to be more cautious about what we're giving consent to. And we need to refuse it when possible. So for a lot of us, refusing these technologies is not possible. And that's understandable. I still use a lot of these technologies, even though I've been studying this for the past 4 years. But I think we need to refuse when possible. For example, the university here at the U of I requires a dual login verification, right? So basically, people have to put in their phone information, and when they log on to a service on campus, they get a phone call and it verifies who they are. When that first got rolled out here, I was very skeptical of it, and I ended up challenging people at the tech services about it. And I said, I don't want you to have access to my phone. Is there any other thing I could do to verify my registration? So they offered me this key fob, so I don't have to use my phone to like, I don't have to connect my phone with their services. I could just click on a button, it gives me a code and I type that in. So I think these are some ways that we could resist this, like, this influence of this information infrastructure, right? And lastly, I don't see academics actually in the forefront of understanding this. A lot of activist groups are way ahead of academics in understanding this. Groups like Mahanthe, OCAD, student groups in science and engineering across the country have recently sort of stood up. A local group led by James Kilgore, challenging incarceration, No Tech for ICE, and Stop, a group of lawyers in New York, have been more active in understanding this new form of government power. All right, and thank you. If you have any questions, please.
Awesome, thank you so much, Daniel. We'll go ahead and move on to the questions because I know we have a few that have been sent already. I think you actually, with that last slide, hit on one of the first ones, which Ken asked if you had any thoughts on actual and emerging resistant practices and movements against digital state surveillance. I don't know if there's anything extra you want to say on that part.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot going on right now. And there's a lot of groups that are challenging this. This is increasingly becoming more and more of an important issue for people. And so, yeah, I'll bring it back to their page. So if you're interested in any of these, here are some of the groups doing it. There's a lot more too.
Awesome. Another question we have is, Lupe asked, thank you for such an illuminating and important talk. My question is about the transnational reach of the US smart border. Do you focus anywhere in your research on how ICE/HSI digital surveillance merge with efforts in Mexico's own turn to surveillance technologies to deter migrant mobility and protect its borders from alleged crime or terrorist threats? And finally, what role do you think more traditional analog forms of monitoring fit into these broader assemblages of digital state surveillance?
Okay, so as far as like the reach of this, so recently I've read some documents about how DHS was going to fund the government of Mexico to build surveillance infrastructure to track Guatemalan immigrants moving through the country. So that way, not to stop them, but in order to understand and have a better understanding of the amount of people moving, right? So I seen that. So yeah, there is, I think there is, there's just a lot in my research. So it's hard for me to like expand without getting lost. So, but I'm sure there's a lot more than just that. That was just one example. And then it's really interesting. I think making me look at this research and the role of documentation has made me question documentation, right? So we could, if I go back, I could look at demographics, like the history of demographics, right? And demographics have always been a technology to show the state what's important and what's not, right? In many ways, that's on one hand good. It provides resources to particular groups, but it also makes particular things more knowable. And once something's more knowable, it becomes more controllable, it becomes more manageable, right? So it's just this, like, it's a very complex issue.
Awesome, thank you. Another question we have from Eileen, are you concerned about your own safety and protection of your data?
Yeah, so I spend a lot of time on DHS's website. A lot of my information comes from like scrubbing their website and just looking for information. So much to the point that I know that they track who's on there. So I have a LinkedIn and an academic EDU program. And all the time I'll have people from DHS like look at my page. They haven't done anything, they haven't reached out to me, but I know that they know that I've been like digging in deep, looking at them, right? I don't know the degree to which they know what I've been doing, or, I don't know anything like that. But I do know that I do have like, because it'll tell you like who's logged on and where they're at. And it's like, okay. All right.
Awesome. Another question we have, Pat asks, why not start an effort to challenge UI sharing of student data with outside entities as you described?
Okay, so we did actually. So in the beginning, everybody's had a COVID app, right? On app. That's actually under the university's Rockwire system or Rockwire system. During summer, people from the GEO sort of came together and were like, what's going on here? So the university at first wanted us completely under that app, but we challenged them a little bit and they created a distinction between the app that is now used for COVID and that app. So it's really difficult because there's a lot of research that needs to be into it. And in many ways, you need to have a language that's both familiar to really technical people like computer science and engineers, and people who are also could have conversations with critical theory. And it's really difficult to like do both. So a lot of people it's just a lot of work, but we have. So if you're interested, you can reach out to me. All right, anyone else?
Yeah, awesome. Let's see. Do ask, thank you for your fascinating talk. As you mentioned, big data have been used in citizenship control. If the data predict patterns, did you have any chances to see how the data contribute to generating racist discourse, such as criminalization of Black and brown bodies?
Well, there's been a lot of research on that, particularly as it pertains to law enforcement. So there's the new Jim Code. Dr. Jefferson in my department here has just come out with a book called Digitize and Punish, where he goes into some of this. The problem with it in my research is that I don't have access to the actual algorithms or formulas being used by DHS. It's all classified, and I've reached out. They're not going to give me access to that information. So it's hard for me to like look at what they're actually looking for. So what I do instead is I look at their own reports that they write about themselves, and then I try to like piece together what they're doing from there.
Gotcha. Awesome, thank you. Also in the chat, Quentin mentioned that there's a reminder, you don't need the app to show your COVID test status. You can actually go to a website he had on there. So thank you for that, Quentin.
Yeah, so that was actually part of the solution that when we challenged the university, they gave us that as a solution too.
Gotcha. And Quentin also asked, how would you say we can solve the issue of information within a department collected legally for what can be considered an objectively good purpose being used for more negative purposes? For example, he includes your example of FEMA data being used by the rest of DHS.
Well, I think we need to have more clear and robust laws that prevent these like these jurisdictional moving around. Because what's happening is that DHS is able to move outside its jurisdiction through these technologies. And we need laws that restrict it back to where it's supposed to be, or if it should exist or not to begin with, So it's legal. I mean, the best way we could, I think, turn it legal is by making it known and talking about it and bringing it up. So that way it's in the public conscious. And then, because if I just talk to someone that say works for FEMA or works for an agency, like works for a local municipal, like city government, and they're like, we need FEMA, and they do, like they need access to the FEMA. But me trying to explain everything else that's going on, it's really difficult. So we just need to make this more common so then it becomes logical for people.
Ken also asked, does open source software movements offer just alternatives?
On one hand, yes and no. So on one hand, these technologies are very impactful the moment they spur up, and they're able to change things for a brief moment, and then DHS is able to respond quickly to. So, for example, there was an app that was created by an activist that shows police information, like it tracks police. It's a police facial recognition. So police have been using facial recognition against particular populations. This activist reversed it on them. But eventually DHS these agencies shut it down. The problem with these open source softwares is that the infrastructure or the internet or anything that it operates on is undemocratic to begin with. Like we don't know, we don't have access, we can't control the infrastructure of the internet. We could build things on top of that infrastructure, but we don't have the ability to change its infrastructure. So until that is made possible, then it's like those open source softwares are very limited, in my opinion.
Someone also asked, just for I guess clarification of, what was the report by Deloitte that you were discussing?
It's radical interoperability. Picking up speed to become a reality for the future of health. Deloitte Insights.
Awesome. Yeah, and I think also comments about how some of the mass surveillance that you talk about is similar to things happening across the world, like in China, for example, as one of the comments said. I think also is a really interesting point.
So this is like taking place in all aspects of government, all aspects of society. It's not just here, and it's not just by DHS. Like even the university, as we've seen, is interested in this type of governance.
Awesome. Well, I think that's all the questions we have. Going great on time. So thank you so much, Daniel. And I know a few people asked this question. So about if there was going to be a recording made available. This was streamed on our YMCA Facebook page, so you can check it out there. But we also will be recording it, or have been recording it, and we'll be uploading it to our Google Drive so we can put it on our website if you're interested in getting this recording for any future use as well.
Okay. Also, if anybody's interested, and wants to reach out for questions, my email's here. So.
Awesome. Yeah, well, thank you so much for everyone who joined us. Thank you, Daniel, for being here and talking to us today. If you were interested in this talk and really enjoyed this, please consider coming back next Friday. Next Friday is actually our second to last Friday forum of the series. And we'll be joined with Dr. Virginia Byrne, who's going to be talking about education and technology, and specifically how higher education can mitigate the power and equity imbalances of online learning. So really interesting conversation, kind of jumping to different factors of social life. So please consider joining us. And yeah, thank you again for being here, for being so involved. Thank you, Daniel, and hope you all have a good rest of your Friday.
Thanks, everyone.